And that brings us to our discussion agenda. Are we staying up?
I'm saying that.
Okay, I was just making sure. Just making sure. All right, so our discussion agenda is number 16, discussion on proposed revisions to board policy KBE, relations with parent organizations, as seen in Exhibit I. Let's start.
So this began with Senate Bill 245 as a bill to mandate local school boards to require criminal background checks of all school booster club officials. The law specifically prohibits persons who have been convicted, pled guilty, or nolo contendere to financial crimes from serving as a financial officer for a booster club. A booster club is defined as a parent-led organization that is not controlled by a school district and has the primary purpose of raising funds for the school district programs, interscholastic athletics, or after-school activities. This would include all PTO and PTA groups as well as booster clubs. Financial officers who maintain the club's financial records or have a signatory authority or financial transactions, accounts, contracts, checks, the law would require them to register annually with the school board or superintendent by August 1st, and the club would be prohibited from dispersing funds for any purpose until that registration has been completed. Upon receipt of a booster club's registration, the law states that a school board may request a criminal records check, including fingerprints from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division of the financial officer. So this proposal or discussion agenda would bring some changes to our current policy KBE. It is modeled after the model policy from the School Board Association, with only two minimal changes that I proposed in the updated policy. One of them I added, the current model policy states that groups who fail to register by the August 1st deadline will be prohibited from dispersing monies raised to benefit school or district programs, and it gives no option to register later than that August 1st deadline. So I added in until registration has been completed and approved by the board. The other modification I made to the model policy states on page 2 that the cost for the background checks will be paid by the booster club or parent organization and not the district. The model policy left that open for discussion, and so that was my recommendation, but definitely open for discussion.
Okay, I have several questions, but I saw Mr. Satterfield, and then I'll go to Ms. Huddle.
Yeah, I had one question. What if you have turnover during the year? In other words, somebody gets ill or somebody gets replaced in a position. I mean, you're dependent on volunteers. Mm-hmm. And let's say that somebody gets ill or they move and somebody has to come on board and replace them. How would you handle that?
I know typically from working with PTO and booster clubs, typically you have the treasurer who is the financial responsibility party for the booster club or PTO, but typically you have the president as the second signatory authority, and so I think we would need to require both of those parties to go through that background check at SLED so that they would both be registered, and then we would address moving another person into that role and requiring a background check as well.
Okay, so you're saying that you're okay with your recommendation after August 1st if there's a situation? Because I know I dealt with a booster club issue, and it happened during the school year, and I had a myriad of changes in that booster club issue. So
I think the August 1st deadline just wants them to register to let the district know who the financial officer is, who the officer for the entire club is. And so I think that was the intent for the registration. And then once those individuals have fulfilled their background check, and just the person that would have financial signature authority, so typically the treasurer or the president, I think that would be that would be okay as long as they're registered by August 1st or a date later and then approved by the board.
Ms. Huddle, did you have a question?
Can I add?
I have a couple too.
A couple together? Okay. I guess my first question is, this says that for review and approval by the board, and we've never done that since I've been here, so the recommendation is that we actually approve a list?
And that's a big question that I have as well. That is only in the model policy. It's not in our existing policy.
Correct. The model policy says review and approval by the board, and this model policy came out even after the August 1st deadline. So in order to scramble to make sure we are in compliant with the law, we have sent out a Google form to all principals of both middle elementary, middle, and high schools to get that information from their PTO, PTAs, and Booster Club. And I sent it out last week and have gotten over 17 registered just with their just with their officers' information. Right now, it doesn't require the SLED background checks, but I think that's where the law and the policy, the model policy, we're moving towards.
Okay. The other question I have is, it talks about the formation of parent groups, and it gives examples, including but not limited to. And I'm just wondering, should the definition be broader, like any group that is affiliated with the school that collects money? I mean, I'm just wondering what kind of groups do we have? Because I know we have, the track club or the, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I just, are we sure where the lines are of what groups this applies to and which groups don't? And is it money? Is it use of school facilities? What's those hard and fast lines?
I think the law and then the model policy gives that very broad definition of booster clubs as including PTO, PTA, anybody that's raising money. But I think that we could definitely look at including any group that raises money, because again, that was the intent of the law, was to require a background check for anybody that's handling funds. While they're not district funds, they're associated with the school and they need to be held accountable for that. And so I think that was the intent. So if that's something that we need to include, we can definitely look at that.
So kind of piggybacking off of that question regarding board approval, what is in the model policy that is not in our existing policy, and I have major concerns about, is the parent organizations desiring to use the name of the district or a school to organize, fundraise, or advertise must obtain the approval of the board as a prerequisite. Continued use of the school's name, logo, mascot, et cetera, is contingent upon compliance with all applicable board policies, et cetera, et cetera. So this policy, this model policy, is basically saying that every group that wants to fundraise, that wants to use, do a banquet, to sell those little cards for the small businesses, discount cards, or sell anything, cookies, or any athletic team that wants to, raise money for uniforms, any booster club, any club that's trying to raise money to go on a trip. Before they do any of that, all of the schools in the district would have to individually, for each project, get board approval. And that seems crazy to me. I feel like we haven't had a major problem with that so far. The law requiring a treasurer of any parent organization or any organization in our district to have a SLED background check, I mean, that's common sense. You don't want to turn over money with someone that has a criminal history of stealing money or, or being untrustworthy. That makes sense. And I get having all of those organizations at the beginning of the year with a deadline, getting a board approval to make sure that has happened. It's not necessarily approving the group. It's just saying, the checks and balances, the approval was granted. Having every organization try to get approval to have any kind of fundraising, I don't know about what my fellow board members think, but I think that's asinine, and we should take that completely out of whatever we're going to propose as a policy, because the administrative burden is crazy.
Let me just add something.
Hold on one second, Mr. Senator.
Okay.
Mr. Scully has
Oh,
his
I'm
hand
sorry.
raised, and I'll...
Yeah, my question in response to that would be, can that be delegated? Can this paragraph be interpreted to be the board delegating that responsibility to the individual, like to the superintendent, who then delegates it to the principals of the schools, and then it kind of reduces that burden? Do we have legal advice
Well,
on?
I don't really even think we should delegate it to the superintendent to delegate it to a principal. I think all of these students, maybe a principal, but
I know at Dutch Forest, like our PTO, because I was chair before I came to the board, our principals was already in those conversations. We couldn't just
I feel like
decide to do an event, and we had to
I
follow
feel like that's
processes.
already happening.
Yeah.
I think it should definitely be decided at the school level. Because it's not being decided right now at the district level. I mean, Dr. Ross is telling me all the time that we're putting too much on the administration and
this is something that we don't have
of our
to put on
schools.
them.
I mean, I just think that this is one of those things where that will prevent student organizations from wanting to have to go through the bureaucracy and red tape of trying to raise money to help kids.
Is it the law that's requiring that?
No, that's the model
So
policy.
that's the policy.
The
that's-
law is the portion about the SLED background checks and having those approvals.
Okay.
The model policy, which comes from the School Board Association, this stuff is in their policy, and we didn't adopt that when we adopted our policy.
Okay.
The other question that I have regarding this is, with the board approval and the board having final authority over all monies raised to benefit a school, become the property of the district, how does that play in? And this is probably going to need legal advice. How does this play in with like our booster clubs that are 501c3s that are not the district, that raise hundreds of thousands of dollars? Would the district be able to come in and the board say, okay, well, this club raised $400,000. We could take some of that money and put it towards this school because they didn't. I mean, those are questions that are being asked. And so and what's the real authority of the school district over a 501c3 raising money for the district? Like, who controls that money?
This policy makes it very gray.
Right. So I just think that we need to, those are answers. If we're changing this, I think that those are answers that we need as we draft the policy. Ms. Huddle?
Yeah, just to clarify, this is a new law. It was just signed into, by the governor. But in looking at the law, it appears that we can't delegate it. But we need a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just reading through it. But what is interesting is it says that we may require a state criminal records check. So I'd kind of like us to look at, can we have some simple form that people fill out? You guys decide who needs a background check, because it should be a lot of money and not selling cupcakes. It should be whatever you guys decide. And that way, when we can just approve them like routinely, kind of like we approve new hires and that kind of thing.
That is different than, the law doesn't say, I don't believe, that you have to approve every fundraiser. It says that you have to.
If it's their major purpose, that's what it defines it as. If a booster club is a parent-led organization not directly controlled by a school or district that is formed with the primary purpose of raising funds for the school district programs, inter-athletics, or after-school
That they
activities.
would have to have a background check.
No, they just have to register. And then the background check is a
Okay.
may, and it
Okay,
doesn't
but what
say
I'm-
who has
okay.
to do it.
Okay, that's where I'm getting confused with what you're saying. What you're saying is in that first paragraph. That is definitely the law. What I'm saying is once they're approved, once they've gotten, I think they should have a background check. I mean, I think that people are shady and you never know. They don't look shady and, then they steal all the money. And yes, I said that, sorry. But, that happens. I think that you should have to have a background check if you're controlling the money. But my big problem with this is saying that you have to approve every individual fundraiser or event, or if you're gonna have a billboard or whatever, if you're raising money for any of the things, that's where I feel like this policy is.
No, I think it's just the organization.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
So
I don't
I'm
think we
just
have to
saying, like,
approve all that.
as we're talking about drafting this policy, like if it comes back for a first reading at our next meeting, I would propose that we take that part out. I don't know if y'all propose that or not. And then I think that there might be a question of whether or not we, sorry, I keep hitting myself on this. I apologize. I just lost my train of thought. Is whether or not we require the SLED background checks. I think that we should do that. Ms. Tucker put that on I'm gonna put this on Ms. Tucker. She put that on the booster club and not our district. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding, because that was an either or in the model
either
policy.
or.
I'm teasing you.
I did work for SLED, so I've had a background check.
I don't have a strong opinion about that one way or the other, but, I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I
on
think
that?
requiring the background check, personally, I think requiring the background check for the financial officer and the president, because they could be a co-signer on any booster club or PTO, I think that would be a good recommendation. I do think we probably should get some guidance on can we designate the approval process to continue with our current approval process? And I've talked to a few people in other school districts to see how they're addressing this, and it seems like there are some that are going through the same approval process, sending things to the board, big things for legal issues to make sure that they are in compliant and they're covered with liability. And so I think you might see a little bit of both, people pushing more things towards the board for approval, and then some people keeping things at the school level, because that is a burden on.
Right. I would just say, if to everyone that or anybody that is listening to this meeting or here, or any other of my fellow board members, if you talk to anyone that's in an organization at we have all of these schools, and they all kind of operate, in their own little realm of something that we're not thinking about, that the policy may affect in a good way or a bad way. I would be interested to know before we change it, because I think every school does things a little bit different. Ms. Barnhart?
I agree with what you're saying. It did seem very vast and a lot of things for us to, like you pointed out, individual bake sales or doing a car wash for uniforms, that's a lot. A thought is kind of how you said we get the updated, hire list every board meeting, maybe just from each individual school. That might even be a lot. Have the principals a list of the things from each school, and then not for approval necessarily, but if it's not within the law that we have to individually approve every single one. So I would like to get legal guidance on this, but
Yeah.
I would like to be informed of what we're doing, even when it comes to bake sales, just to, support our schools and our teachers in those groups. But it does seem like a lot to individually approve by the board every single.
It definitely seems I don't know, it seems a little extreme, that portion of it. Okay, any other thoughts on the discussion part of this policy under item 16? Okay, are you staying for the rest?
No, I'm not.
Okay. All right, thank you, Ms. All right.
Thank you, Ms. Tucker. So what we'll do is, I understand, we'll get with legal counsel about the limits of the law and delegation, and then bring that back for first reading.
Okay. And that brings us to item 17, which is the discussion of proposed revisions to board policy KEC, library media center material selection and reconsideration process under Exhibit J.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. Our Chief Academic Officer, Tina McCaskill, will come forth with revisions to KEC, or discussion of KEC and KECR. As you're aware, on June 25th of this year, Regulation 43-170, it actually became law, taking effect on August 1st. This does, as mentioned earlier, have impacts to our financial position, and so we wanted to begin the discussion so that we're in compliance with this law. So, Ms. McCaskill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Dr. Ross, and Board. If you will agree, I would like to really discuss KEC and KECR at the same time. There it is.
Dr. Ross was supposed to say that, but he didn't. He's whispering in my ear. That's fine.
Okay, great. So, because they really go hand in hand. So you'll see, first of all, I am going to make an apology before I go any further. Last time we met, we talked about whether or not the material had to be removed while you were making a decision. That was in our current policy. That is not in the current law. So just so you know that, we do not have to remove the material until the decision is made. So that was a mistake that I made, and I wanted to make sure that I cleared that up. So the material does not have to be taken off the shelf until the decision is made, okay? So with KEC, the model policy that you have in front of you is pretty succinct in terms of just the KEC piece of it. So the KECR is where you're going to see more in terms of how this plays out. So how do we actually implement it? So what we are proposing, whenever we discuss this, we're proposing to add some things to the KECR model policy. We'd like to add, like, the definitions, first of all, and you see that on these slides, the definitions of what an instructional material is, the definition of the instructional program, what age and developmentally appropriate means, and these are straight out of the law. So these are not District 5 definitions. These are definitions that come out of the law. Complainant is not in the law as a definition itself, but we do feel that that's important to just make sure that we know that a complainant is the parent or legal guardian of a student within the district. And then the word reasonable comes up, and that's also not defined within the law. And so that's something that we've taken a shot at to put a definition here, certainly something we can discuss. But reasonable meaning requesting information that is easily acceptable and does not take away from the teacher's instructional planning time to prepare. And then looking at the procedure for selection and review of instructional materials, these are just some things that are really straight out of the law that are listed here, that are not listed in the model policy, that we're just recommending be things that you consider, that we add to the KECR. Certainly the criteria that's listed there, making sure that we list the fact that we will maintain a list on the website for our library materials, making sure that we put on there that parents can ask, and this is where that word reasonable comes into play, really needing to define what reasonable is and being able to decide what that process is going to be for a parent if they want to request all of the supplemental materials that a child has access to. So without reading all of that to you, I certainly can I just hit a button. Without reading all of that to you, those are things for us to discuss in terms of additions. So I'm going to stop there for a few minutes and just ask you to think about that. And then there's some things within the law that are definite, that are things that the board has to make a decision on that I'll talk you through as well. But let's talk about those additions and what you're thinking in terms of what do you feel about that?
Anyone? Okay.
I had trouble finding where you said that y'all added the definition of instructional materials. Is that in KEC or KECR? And can you help me find it?
We would be adding it to KECR, but if you look at the law itself, those definitions are right at the beginning of the law.
So you're saying you would add it to the model policy, but
Correct.
that wasn't in the packet, right?
That is
okay.
correct.
Just making sure.
The law itself is in the packet.
Right, but you're saying we have the model policy, and your suggestion would be to take that one and add the definition from the law.
Correct.
Great. Okay,
And
thanks.
I just want to just kind of couch this discussion. We got this like 4 days before the packet was due. So we were asking, Madam Chair, if we could just kind of take today to kind of build our notes. Then we'll meet with our principals also to get feedback on reasonable. And that way, when we bring back a recommendation policy, it would have all of this deliberation included.
I would say I have a question about the definition of reasonable and the definition that that was provided as a suggestion. I guess my question about it is, you're right, reasonable isn't defined, that it is hard to define because what I think is reasonable is different than what you think is reasonable. But if you're going to define it and put it in a policy, like, should there be parameters of guidelines? Because this is saying requesting information that's easily accessible and does not take away from the teacher's instructional planning time to prepare. Well, anything that you request, if you're challenging something of material and saying that it's unreasonable, however that's resolved, it's going to take time away from planning and preparing for our class. right? And, and what makes it hard to define that and to say we should define it is because is it dependent on the circumstance? Like maybe depending on what the lesson is, reasonable is a teacher needs to be able to define this within a 1 to 2 day time frame because this is when we're covering the material in class, or is it, a long-term project and a week?
Now, remember that this is talking about asking for the list of all materials being used in the classroom. This is not the complaint.
So then reasonable would be immediate, because they should have that, right?
They will have their classrooms, they will have any syllabus or newsletters or emails to the parents with that material, they will have that. But let's say that the parent wants specific names of videos that they've used. That may be something that could take extensive time, that may take more than 1 to 2 days to pull from. Because they wouldn't necessarily, they could go through their lesson plans and find that, but they wouldn't necessarily have just a spreadsheet of all the videos that they have used, like from YouTube or whatever they might pull it from.
So that would tie into our discussion on our supplemental materials policy.
Yes.
And so reasonable might be in this policy defined as one way, but how we transfer that into other policies and other uses is something to be cognizant of, right? I'm not trying to
other policy
overcomplicate
doesn't
this, but-
necessarily use the word reasonable. This is actually the only policy that uses that word as reasonable, and it's only talking about the reasonable request of the parent for the materials.
Okay.
So that's the only place that word is used.
Anybody have any other thoughts? Mr. Satterfield? Can you turn your mic on, please? You're okay.
Just so I can put my thoughts in line, because when I was looking at that, I was studying KEC and then referred to KCR, and it kind of bounces back and forth, to be honest with you. I do like the South Carolina School Board Association model policy statement that says any parent or legal guardian of any student who attends a school in the district who has made a good faith effort to address their concerns at the school level. I think that's one of the things that I've heard from teachers. Of course, the teachers feel a little overwhelmed by this law, like I'm sure many of us have heard. But the idea that if there's a concern from a parent, if they should at least exhibit a good faith effort that they've tried to solve the problem. If it's an issue with a book, there's always an alternative book that can be used. If it's an issue with something that's in the class, there are other classes they can take. They can transfer to another class. There's a myriad of things that I know that I dealt with when I was a principal. But I think that teachers are feeling, and principals, I believe, are feeling like all this goes over their head. And people have direct access to this law, to this board, and that's why we're discussing this tonight, to try to make heads or tails of it. But they feel a little helpless, and then they're being told, and I know that a lot of schools and a lot of districts, I've talked to folks in other districts, and they're scrambling to try to make heads or tails of this. But I just wanted to say that, getting back to KEC, I do like that. It's sort of a good faith in your teachers that parents have at least made the attempt to talk with the teachers about the books or the instructional material that is being used.
I agree. I think it's really great that that language actually came from the state regulation, from the Department of Education. It's not the model policy. I think that's great.
And my other, let me see if I can find my other question. I'm sure we'll talk more about the law. I'm assuming we'll talk a little bit more about the law. But the way that this whole thing is being presented, it is so encompassing and for everything. It's not just for a book or a textbook. It is encompassing for everything imaginable that a teacher can use in the classroom. And I know over the years, I know lots of teachers that they'll get a class and they'll start searching on the internet. They'll start looking for stuff that they can use to help better meet the needs of their students. And that's just good teaching. And that's what we ask teachers to do, to try to meet the needs of their kids. So I'm concerned, and I know I expressed my concern in the last board meeting. This myriad, all this language, page after page after page, that is being sent to our district and to our teachers. And obviously, they're not in education. They wrote this law to be all-encompassing, but it's like a lot of things. They're not the ones that have to put it into practice. And so they've made it very challenging for schools and school boards and everybody else to make heads or tails of this. But
I will say just one thing to try to keep, because there's a couple of things here that are needing to stay kind of separate. So you've got the complaints from parents that they're against maybe a topic or a material that's being used. That's what the good faith effort of trying to solve it at the school level before it comes to the board. So that's the complaint that we don't like a particular topic that's being addressed or a book that's being used or whatever. And then there's this word reasonable when it's talking about asking just for a list of materials that are being used. They're not necessarily challenging the material at this point. They're just asking for the list of all the materials that are being used. That's where the word reasonable is coming into the law and even into the policy. So it's really, those are two separate things to keep in mind. So you've got a process for parents that are trying to complain or against a particular topic. That's where the good faith effort and the schools are trying to handle it. And then you've got this reasonable request, but you have to be a parent within the school district to ask for the list of materials that are being used in a single classroom.
And I understand that. I fully understand that. I mean, teachers have syllabus, and they have all this, or syllabi, and they have all this available to them. I think that the teachers initially, a lot of them were concerned because they had to get all this before school started. And they were trying to get ready to teach a lesson or learn their new textbooks. And they had all this information they were supposed to gather for the whole year before we even got cranked up, so to speak. So just some reasonableness. I mean, I don't know that any teacher, I've never worked with a teacher that would refuse to share with a parent. If a parent said, can you tell me what y'all are studying or what materials y'all are using? And again, most teachers post that. They post the books they're using, and the supplemental materials that they're using. So I think that is within reason for teachers.
I agree.
Okay, Mr. Scully?
Yeah, and I agree with your comments about the good faith effort, but my question is, is there any teeth in that? What is a good faith effort? Should we provide any kind of instructional language to the policy that would kind of outline examples of good faith effort, or we're going to have people just submitting or shooting off an email to a teacher or a principal real quick and then turning right around and complaining?
But are we, though? I said, are we, though?
Well,
Are we going to have so many complaints that I'm asking because we don't have that many complaints now. I mean, you get them every now and then.
Sure,
but I mean,
but it's possible. There's no, without a kind of any instructional language in the policy, that could very well happen, and then we could have that. I mean, it's certainly possible.
Yeah. Ms. Barnhart.
I mean, I do think that there will be opportunities, but like you said, we don't get that many complaints. I mean, throughout a school year, very here and there few. And it is a very all-encompassing legal definition that they've come out with, but I think there's just been so many instances of it kind of being read in different ways and that being brought down to the classroom level that it needed to be more of a larger definition of these things in order for school boards to enact their policies after that. So.
And I kind of take it as this regulation was drafted by the State Department of Education And we haven't even got, I mean, we're talking like on the very surface level of this conversation, because we haven't even gotten to the fact that this policy, it also has like that whole appellate process. So we have to figure out, you know, when something is challenged from our perspective as a board, you know, how that's handled. But then ultimately, everything is going to be taken to the Department of Education, to the state board, to review, and they're ultimately going to decide if something is done in good faith or is reasonable. I mean, those are things that are going to go beyond. That's why they instituted this regulation, to kind of consolidate all of the different districts doing different things, and to have their, you know, an accountability factor that goes beyond a local board.
I was just wondering if we can, in the interest of time, if we can get, the administration asked us some really good questions,
Yep.
if maybe we
I
could
think
get
that's
back to
great.
that. And I think we hit reasonable, that there's some suggestion that we tighten up that definition, I guess. And then I thought maybe we could go on to the evaluating committee. Does the, you know,
Yeah.
feedback on 3 people versus the whole board?
Ms. McCaskill, would you like to kind of, I know that this is your presentation.
I took some notes, and we can take this information and we can hopefully next time maybe try to come with a draft based on what you all are saying. So that's kind of what we would like to do. So that's great. So this is the evaluating committee. So the board has to decide if you want to have a 3-person committee to hear the complaint first, and then that be brought to the whole board, or if you want the whole board to hear a complaint and make a decision based on the whole board. Now, remember, what has to happen in a public hearing is that both sides have to have that opportunity. So you'd have to have a public hearing where you can have the complainant would be able to present their case, but then anyone that wants to speak publicly, either for or against that, would be able to do that as well. So that would be our first question.
So how about, what I suggest doing with this is kind of going down the line, because everybody kind of probably has an opinion on this one. I'm going to start with Mr. Scully, just because of my body is turned that way.
My first inclination would be the full board.
Okay. Mr. Satterfield.
I'm going to vote against Mr. Scully's recommendation.
There's not a vote, we're just talking.
I want to say, if it's an elementary book, it goes to this end. If it's like Moby Dick or a 600-page book, it goes to the other end. No, I like the idea of the 3 board member and a committee that involves, again, community members and teachers.
So it's not going to do that, because the state law
So
identifies.
it's just 3 board members and that's it?
The options are a 3-person committee of board members or the entire board.
Well, have we talked about how the process will work? Do we read the book and review it, or do we just hear excerpts from the book?
So I believe that that's also defined in the regulation, that you're reading what is actually being challenged.
It actually does not state that
It
you
doesn't?
have to do that.
It
What it
doesn't?
does say is that the complainant has to have read it, but it does not specify that in the law.
But I would say that we would want whoever is
yeah, I would
reviewing it
say.
to read the entire thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
but,
I read a 700-page book, yes.
Me too.
well, I think in all fairness, if it's something that is that important, that the book should be read in its entirety. That's just me. Again, I would not look forward to having to read Moby Dick or
But-
Tale of
but
Two
when we're
Cities,
talk-
but,
What we're talking about, the committee, like who consists. I'm trying to keep it, I'm getting looks.
I understand. I'm in favor of 3.
Of 3, not the whole board? Okay, Mrs. Snipes.
Just because I missed the beginning of this particular piece, I just want to clarify that the 3-person committee, are they presenting back to the board when the complainant presents back to the board? But they're not making a final decision on behalf of the board. They're just being tasked with presenting the viewpoint. I could support a committee that does that.
I personally think it's an unnecessary step. I mean, we're a committee of 7. We're all duly elected to make these decisions. Some decisions are harder than others, but at the same time, these decisions need to come to a body of 7.
Okay, I 100% agree with that. And also, one of the reasons why I think that is because even if you have a committee of 3 that reports back to the board their recommendation, that committee of 3 has the ability to actually be there and hear and ask questions. And the full board wouldn't have that. And that doesn't mean, and I feel like I feel, you know, it doesn't matter if it's this board or another board or 10 years.
This isn't a pushback thing. So I think that got lost in translation for me too.
Right.
So, because I still thought everybody had an opportunity to ask questions and what.
But if you're going to have a committee meeting, like if you have a committee of 3 hearing a panel, they're probably going to do that outside of a regularly scheduled board meeting. That's probably going to be, if not, see, I've never really
changed my vote.
understood, because sometimes you have these boards that have these committees, and then the full board will be there, and then they break into a committee.
Okay.
And only those 3 people talk about what's going on, and the rest of the board's sitting there.
I changed my
and
vote.
I think that's
I
weird.
misunderstood.
Yeah, I feel like that's weird.
I changed my position.
I just think that's kind of strange. But, I mean, that's why I feel like I want to be able to ask a question, because, you know, especially because we are elected. It can get political, even if it shouldn't get political, and you might just not agree with one another. Ms. Huddle, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with you completely.
You sound so surprised.
I know. I would add, though, another reason I agree with you is that if whoever those 3 people are selected, if they're chosen out of a hat, they're still a minority of the board. So the other reason I agree with you is then you get, well, let's say they said to do away with the material or change the material, and then the full board rules differently. Now you just have another conflict.
Right.
And it's just not necessary.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up.
Do you agree with me, Ms.
I
Barnhart?
do agree with you, Ms. Hines, Ms. Blackburn-Hines. But because of that fact, I mean, if we were a larger board and had more, and just to kind of delegate, I could see that. But there's 7 of us, we all work together, and like you said, we're all duly elected. And it just makes sense that if we're going to create this process in general, that we do it as a full board. Yeah.
Ms. Hines,
Mr. Scully?
I went first, so technically
now
you
you're
all
changing.
agree with me.
Because you want to agree. All right. So did you kind of pick up what we were all throwing down?
Got you. I'm going to summarize that the majority of the board would prefer the full board, and it sounds like you would like somewhere in the board policy that you would have to read the material.
There definitely something related to what the challenge is. I believe personally you should read what it is being challenged.
I do have one quick question just on the process. So the complaint is filed with the school, I'm assuming it goes to the district, and then comes to us. We review the complaint, we read the material. Do we present our findings at the next board meeting, or what happens
I think
after we
that's the
review
next
it?
slide.
So
the
let's
next
look at
slide?
the next
Okay.
slide.
Sorry,
Let's
okay.
look at the next slide. You have 90 days from the time that the complainant would have to fill the form out, which is the KECE that you have. That's a state form, nothing really to discuss because the state says we have to do that one. So that form would go to Ms. White, and you would have 90 days to actually hear and make a decision based on that, okay? So if we go to the next slide, we'll just go ahead and go to you, Ms. Barnhart, and then we'll talk a little bit about the first bullet. So I'm going a little bit out of order, just following your conversation. But if you look at the 5th paragraph that's really in the law, it says, if the district board finds that existing instructional materials identified in a complaint do not satisfy the requirements of this regulation, the district board shall remove entirely or discontinue use of the materials for any grade level or age group for which such use is inappropriate or unsuitable, or will make such materials available to students only upon receipt of the consent of a student's parent or legal guardian. This is the part that gets a little bit confusing that we need to talk about. The board will announce its decision and will provide an explanation for its conclusion and decision, either orally at the public meeting, if such meetings are recorded or transcribed, or in writing. The board's decision will be made publicly available within 15 days of the meeting, which is a little unusual there, because if you're going to make it in a public meeting, if you're going to make your decision in a public meeting, I don't know why it says make it available within 15 days. It's available immediately. So that's where it kind of contradicts itself there.
I would think that that is if you're going to provide an opinion in writing.
But if
You
you've got to
have
have a
15
public meeting,
Well, but you,
I mean, you'd have to vote in public, right?
yeah, so you would have your meeting, probably the hearing in which the complainant and the district, or, whoever is presenting their individual sides,
I
you
would
have a
interp-
meeting.
I would interpret that just because it says, shall announce its decision in that meeting if such meetings are recorded or transcribed or in writing made public. So if there's,
And
for some
I
reason, a
think that
meeting is
there's
not
probably
transcribed or
districts
whatever,
that are
yeah.
not
So if they don't
always
have the transcription,
broadcasting
yeah.
their meetings.
If they don't have that,
and-
then it would have to be
And
provided
that just
15
isn't
days.
really relevant to us because we broadcast our meetings. All of our meetings are public. If we had, I cannot imagine a situation where we have some kind of challenge and we do not have it broadcast. I just can't. I
And
mean, I just can't see that happening. I don't think necessarily that we need a written opinion
And I
for
mean,
what you can go on YouTube and hit play and see exactly what happened.
to your point, I mean, I'm interpreting that as that's 15 days to publish the minutes. You know,
But the minutes aren't going to really.
I understand that, but on certain situations where they're not broadcasted live and they're not on
Yeah.
YouTube, where you can refer back to them, you know, I see this policy in place to where you've got 15 days to approve those minutes to make them public. I could be
If I
interpreting it
got-
wrong,
yeah.
but
Yeah. Mr. Satterfield and then Mr. Scully.
Yeah, I just want to play devil's advocate just for a second. It says when making decisions to select or retain specific instructional materials, it says you should use the following criteria. The material's academic or educational rigor, the material's educational significance, the validity, the accuracy, the objectivity, the currency. I'm not sure who's up for that. The finite availability of library shelf space and whether the space occupied could be better spent on material with greater academic rigor. Objectivity, accuracy, educational merit, or quality. Now,
So that is to keep it, that is to get it in the school and keep it in the school, not for the challenge.
well, it says when making decisions to select or retain. So can somebody, and my question is, can somebody challenge material based on any of those?
Yes.
Yeah.
I know you heard what I just read. I want you to think about accuracy, whether the space could be better used for another book. It's not, I know that we talked earlier, let me just finish this thought, because I'm old and I'll lose my train of thought. Initially, we were talking about how it was basically for sexually explicit materials. At least that was the understanding. But as I said before, we got 4, 5 pages that, as Ms. Barnhart said, is so all-encompassing, it's like it covers everything, anything that could cross into the threshold of a school. And I do hope and pray that you're right, Ms. Hines, that we'd have very few, if any, challenges regarding this. But it gets back to my initial comment that I hope that something is in this policy, whatever policy we come up with, that says that people have made a good faith effort to settle this matter with the teachers or with the principals at the school level. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't want to be the one that has to make this sort of decision as a school board member, and it can become very political, unfortunately. And the idea, and I will express this, I'm concerned that this mandate takes away I don't want to say the authority, but takes away the good judgment of a local school board. I mean, we're a local school board, and we've been elected to serve our communities and do what's best for our kids, but folks can challenge our judgment too, and now take it to another level. And I'm personally, I'm just not happy with that idea, so.
Mr. Scully, hold on, Mr. Scully? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
Ms. McCaskill, to your point, I think the key to that is the last sentence that's not highlighted. The decision which needs to be published will include an explanation of how the board applied and complied with the criteria, and I think that's what needs to be published within 15 days. So that may not come up and be made clear during a public meeting. So I think that would, in my interpretation of that, it would be the chair that would need to kind of put that in writing.
You know what I think might be helpful to add to this policy, maybe like in the administrative rule part of this, is like a criteria form for the board to use as they are hearing a case. Because I know when we had our book challenge, we didn't have any of that because a book had never come to us before. There was no one that could give any specific guidance. We were kind of, looking and researching how to handle it as a board ourselves without policy to back it up, and that's probably because a book hadn't risen to us before. So kind of to spell out those concerns, I think that like if we had a form that had like a checklist of the requirements of how a material was brought to District 5 in the first place, and then also in this little in this paragraph, it does say that the board shall remove entirely the material or keep it available with parental permission.
Correct.
And so I think if there's a form that that outlines, the criteria that we're using to judge a material and to make a decision, it would be good to also have a little checklist of what we think should happen. Because you might not have to remove a book entirely if there is a way to implement parental consent. I don't know. Just my thought. I don't know if there's something that could be drafted to see what that looks like in writing, maybe.
We had something similar to that with our previous policy, so we can take that same idea and just utilize the criteria set forth and put that in there. So that's
Okay. That
something
just
we
wasn't
can do.
really given to us when we did our, when we had our book challenge. We didn't have a checklist. I think that would be helpful. Ms. Barnhart?
Yeah, I understand that the people who are listening to this or watching online, or even the slide that we're seeing, it says fifth paragraph, that's coming from the State Board of Education's policy that we were given. So it's in our packet that we're reading off that, like Mr. Satterfield just read off after paragraph 3. Number C was, I'm assuming, where you were reading from, the academic, educational rigor, all of that, the material designations. The next paragraph, actually, in D, it says, in no event shall a school district's board's decision to remove existing instructional material or to reject the proposed addition of new instructional material be based primarily on or motivated by the district board's disagreement with or opposition to the viewpoints expressed therein. So that's kind of a guideline and parameter just off the top from the State Board of Education that's saying we shouldn't make our decision based off of political views or whatever, and once we kind of make that more finite in our own policy, like you said, with the form or whatever. I mean, I think that's the purpose of that is being stated in the model policy to say it shouldn't be for political or personal or, expressing
And I think that should
opinions.
be in whatever
I think that should be in
whatever
our
form we
policy as well.
have and whatever policy we agree on, there should be something to that effect in there.
Sure.
I mean, from, in my opinion. Okay. So did that answer the questions for that discussion question?
It did. The only other thing, and this kind of leads to some of the things that you all have already talked about. It does put the responsibility on the board in terms of the complaint's been filed, the responsibility of the board is to hear it. Do you want input from administration going into that? For instance, I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that a book or material has been challenged, and let's say there's a group of teachers that utilize that material. do you want us to have for you the standards that are being utilized with that book and what types of lessons are being used so that you can see from a perspective of the teaching points, do you want to see what that material is being used for, not so that you have that input as well as what the complaint is? Do you want that input from us?
If I can go first?
Yes,
I
sir.
always want that information from you, so yes.
Mr. Satterfield, thoughts?
And now that you say that, I'm just trying to think as I go. It might be not only have, if a teacher is challenged, or a school is challenged, or a department, or however it comes to, it surfaces, it might be good to have something, I don't know, in writing, or have somebody explain to the board.
Well, that's what the, what's the word, the hearing.
Well, I
that-
understand the
that-
hearing, but the hearing, first of all, I don't know how the hearing's going to go. I don't know, is somebody going to stand up in the public and read out all the bad words that they don't want that they're concerned about, or
Well, I think it's said that the complainant will say their side and the district will say their side.
Well, I understand that, but I was not in favor of allowing folks to stand up and read the bad language publicly. There are books that have different offensive things and words that might offend some and not others. I'm okay with them sharing with the board their concerns and expressing what their concerns are, but I'm not sure that if there's something in there that's sexually explicit or racially charged or whatever it might be, that it's appropriate to have somebody stand up in public participation
But
and
it's
read
okay
it
for
out
it to be in
loud.
the
All right,
schools?
hold
I
on,
think
we're
that's
gonna,
kind of the
all right,
question.
so what we're doing right now is going one by one to say if we would want the administration to give us materials prior to the hearing. And that's what, so I'm trying to keep us on track
No,
here
yeah,
so we don't
I
go off.
understand, and I apologize for
No, no,
getting
no,
off
no,
track.
it's okay, it's
I
okay.
just, I guess I was trying to make a bigger point, but I would like to have some input as to how it's being used educationally and not just at face value.
Okay, and that's what you were asking, okay. Yes.
I guess my question is, according to the law, the policy, we're not to give feedback. The feedback comes from the community, correct? So
Correct.
we would remain silent. Only the complainant would present to the board. The administration would be silent on that.
That is correct. Now, the teacher can come in, and if they choose, the teacher could come in. Both sides can come into that. We are not supposed to be necessarily involved in that hearing.
But
That
you
is
are
correct.
hearing from the district professional that is being challenged. They have the opportunity to
They
speak.
have the opportunity to do
Okay.
that. What I'm asking is, would you like for us, because there are some teachers that are going to be more than willing to stand up here and be able to talk about what they do, and then there's some that this is just intimidating to them, and they just don't necessarily, they're more than happy to put it in writing and let us turn it in to you, but they don't really want to stand here. And I don't want to.
I guess then we need to kind of clarify that as well, because what is being given to us. So I kind of interpreted that question as, and I don't know if Mr. Scully based his opinion on this, or Mr. Satterfield, or we haven't gotten through everybody else, but that the administration or their proxy would we want them to provide any kind of clarification or information prior to said hearing? Or not necessarily having a free-for-all, anybody that wants to submit opinions, it would come from you, or,
Correct.
And all of that information or clarification would be consolidated into like one little packet or something that would be given to us within a certain period of time prior to, because we have 90 days. So, the administration would have 30 days to prepare something to give to us as we prepare to hear whenever we hear I don't know. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I definitely want both sides of the issue, whether it's the complainant's issue and their explanation, and I want the other side, whoever provides that. So, and I'm curious, Dr. Ross, were you saying that the law does not allow the district to opine?
It does not require, so in our current process,
Doesn't
and I'm just
require.
gonna ask Ms. McCaskill to correct me. In our current process, once we get the complaint, I set a committee, and the committee comes together and they give the recommendation. That recommendation can be appealed to the board, and so we would have a district rep, or whoever chaired that committee, they would present one side, and then the complainant would present the other side, and then you would have our materials we provide that in the packet of why the committee made their decision, and then the complainant would make their decision, and the board makes it. In this policy, only the complainant is given access to the board within that 90 days. But the question is, do you want a group to make a recommendation from the administration?
Yeah, if that's allowable under the law, then I would like that because I think it's most fair to all parties.
Okay, in the
I'm sorry,
interest.
Ms. McCaskill, you want to correct
I
me?
don't think we can make a group. I don't think
recommendation.
we can make a recommendation. I think it has to come to the board for them to make that decision. Now, we can provide for them the factual information of how it's being
That's what I meant,
used.
yeah.
But I don't think that we can provide a recommendation.
I apologize for the recommendation. I thought the explanation of it.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ms. Snipes. I'm just trying to get everybody's feedback before. Ms. Snipes, what are your thoughts, do you think?
Yes, I like the material.
Mr. Hogan?
Do you need any of my time to finish your? Okay. I mean, yeah, so, to Mr. Satterfield's point, you know, when a book is challenged and it's brought to a public hearing, you know, we are tasked with the responsibility to protect minors, right? The overwhelming majority of our students are minors. And so if there's a topic inside a book that's being challenged that isn't necessarily appropriate to read in front of a bunch of adults, we might need to check if it's truly appropriate for the minors that we are protecting. When it comes to this question regarding the information that's provided, I mean, I think the more information, the better. I think all the information pertaining to the scope of the challenge, the libraries the books have been in, to the extent of how many times these books have been checked out inside our libraries, to what extent they're being circulated inside our schools prior to us making these decisions. But I do think the more information, the better.
I agree with that. I mean, I think even in our own situation, I did my own research to put everything into context for myself because I didn't feel like I was getting that information. And I wanted, you know, there's a lot of rumors that people were making decisions without reading books or knowing what they were talking about, and that wasn't true because I was trying to figure things out. And so it's helpful, you know, if we're given information to help with that. And so I think that there should be, but I do think Ms. McCaskill did hit on something that I think is really important. It's not, when it gets to us, we're not looking for an administration's recommendation. We're looking to see what was actually in the school or what, you know, what the situation was, and then we're tasked with making the decision. It's not like a typical, you know, board decision where we do rely heavily on the administration's recommendation. This regulation was designed expressly with the board's opinions and, you know, and their decision-making abilities. So I think that it kind of undermines the intent of this regulation for us to rely on anybody outside. You know, I think we're supposed to be a neutral party here. So, Ms. Huddle.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I would suggest maybe a form to give us information, you know, what grades is it used for, what classes is it used for, is it in the library, what's the purpose of using it, you know, how is it curated, whatever information, so it's not opinion, it's just information, so that we get a sense for how and why the material came about, and maybe a place for other, because whatever those things you want to tell us, there's always going to be something that doesn't fit in a box. So
Like, how did
just
it
a
get through the
suggestion.
KEC process?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
From, that's how it was selected, like, how
Right.
was it selected? Yeah,
Based off prior situations, no.
okay.
Okay.
Did you get all of that feedback on that
I
question?
have it. I've got it. We're good.
Ms. Hines, can I make one other point?
Yes.
I didn't catch earlier, but the state's policy has 90 days within receiving the complaint, and it says within. So I would think we could set ours lower, and I'd like us to consider that just because these things hang over us like a dark cloud. And so I would, just from me, suggesting maybe 45 days or something that gives us time to get it on the board agenda, but not let it, maybe, that's 3 months, that's a long time to hang out there. So just a thought.
Or maybe there'd be some parameters, because what if somebody made a challenge right before Christmas? Or, I agree, 90 days seems like, I think what is it, 30 days or 60 days for our policy now?
I think it was 30. And
30
we could say
for
typically
the
within.
original committee to read it, and then for it to come to us, we had a certain period of time. I think that 3 months is, I agree with that it might need to be a little bit shorter, depending on.
Can I say if you left it within 90 days, that doesn't mean that you have to wait till 90 days?
Right.
But if you have a 1,000-page book, it may
Right.
take you 45 to 60 days versus a child's
Maybe the
book. It might not
language-
take you that long. but
Maybe
it
the
does
language
give you
of
that.
whatever policy expresses, within 90 days, but preferably
I
45 or
dissent.
60, or some, I don't know.
I want the 90 days. If I got to read War and Peace, give me 90 days.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. That's everything on this policy, KUC, KUCR. Anybody have any final thoughts? And so the game plan on this is that, Ms. McCaskill, for the next meeting, y'all are going to have a proposed consolidated policy that we may have to tweak and perfect, but so we see it all kind of together in how it would look.
Correct. And now that we have some input and we kind of know what you're looking for, I think that will help us craft that.
And do you think you have enough time to do that before our next board meeting, or should we push that to the second board meeting in September? I'm asking because I know there's some other policies we want to talk about, and, just for the record, just even putting policies on the agenda takes like a 30-minute discussion in a board officers meeting. So, I just want to make sure.
Our goal was, we wanted another shot at discussion. So we did not want to move it to another agenda, but we wanted to make the recommendations, bring it back for another discussion as we talk about other policies coming up.
Okay, so, but my question was, do we think
I'll put it on.
we're putting it on for discussion the next time?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, not a first reading?
No, ma'am,
Okay,
with your permission.
okay. Well, you had mentioned the funding situation, so I just want to make sure
Right.
that we're not postponing it too long from our.
Correct, and that's what I think, and we will, I think we'll have a better idea. We've heard from the board, now we want to hear from our principals on Wednesday, so I know we have a board officers meeting next Tuesday, so what I'd like to do is hear from them. If we're ready for first reading after Wednesday, then we can come to that meeting ready for first reading.
Okay,
But as the practitioners, I want to give them an opportunity to lean into what you were saying tonight and be able to make recommendations. So
Okay.
we'll have that recommendation by Tuesday.
okay. All right. So that moves
takes
us
us-
to the next fund policy.
Yes, this takes us to IJK.
Can I interrupt for a second here? I would like, with your permission, Madam Chair, we may toggle between these two policies, so permission to take these as a tandem here.
The policy.
These are the
19 and-
supplemental
19 and 20?
19 and 20, yes.
Okay, yep, just kind of like what we just did with KEC and KECR.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
reason
that's
with that, and the reason I wanted to share this is if there's one policy that's causing a lot of concern from our teachers and our administrators, it is the current, it's the IJK policy. IJK policy has the language that the principal must approve supplemental materials. And I think it's important to understand why this is causing issue with our principals and our teachers. I think going back to the history of this policy, the additions or changes that were made in October or December 2013 was to split this policy into two different policies. So to understand the split, you have to go back to 1986. And so in 1986, the sentence, the principal must approve, it was not supplemental materials in that policy. It was the VHS tapes. This was a copyright policy in 1986. And so if you think about what the principal did in 1986, it was, I think it was like 3 TVs in the whole building. You had to wheel them down to the classrooms. And any material that was rented or purchased, or any VHS tape that was rented or purchased, was actually approved by the principal. In 2013, when this policy was separated, it was actually brought by our CFO, because this was about purchasing materials and not violating the copyright. 2 policies were created. One was in our business policy, and the other one was IJK. The reason I wanted to take both of these at the same time is that the law requires us to have a IJL policy within our KEC. Not all districts have an IJK. So we're one of a few districts in the Midlands that actually have an IJK. So we really don't need both. We can kind of combine them to one, or take the IJL and incorporate it into our IJK. There's an assumption that a principal approves every piece of material that enters into a classroom. Now, there's 2 principals that have been up here on this table, and I can tell you that doesn't happen. Didn't happen in 1986, didn't happen in 2013. We have some classrooms that don't even have textbooks, a lot of electives. To think that a principal with 87, 100, 150 teachers with 3 different sections are approving every piece of material that enters into the classroom, that whoever wrote this policy, that didn't happen. So what we're trying to do is comply with that. And so we have made a recommendation. I know it is shifting a lot of practice for teachers, because if you don't have a textbook, you don't have a curriculum, you create every day 90 minutes, 50 minutes of instruction per class. You're creating this, and there is no one person that reviews all of that. Their entire class is supplementary. So as a result, for our teachers that are watching this, for our principals that are watching this, I know it's a shift in their practice. But when it's leveraged that, well, it was in your policy, I want to understand how this originated. There is no one person who has reviewed every piece of material, website, magazine that has come into that. That was the duty of the teacher. Now, if it was controversial, there were some items with that. So we've made a recommendation. I'd like Ms. McCaskill to kind of walk through it, of how we're trying to bring our practice into policy. Ms. McCaskill.
So Dr. Ross, just going off of what you were just talking about, the policy that was from 1986 that did transition, a statement that was in there that I thought was pretty interesting. It says, selection of appropriate supplemental materials shall be made by the principal or director of each school from recommendations by faculty members. So the staff members, the original intent, the staff members recommend to the principal what to purchase. And then the principal then purchases, and that approval used to be signature on paper for purchase orders. It's not like IV where we could go in and digitally approve it. It was signatures on paper for purchase orders. So that was the original intent of the law. So there has been lots of discussion. I've spoken with PSTA. We had a legislator reach out. There's been lots of discussion about this. There's a lot of angst with teachers. There's a lot of angst with principals. I spent 2 hours last Thursday on our day that we had for weather. I had 2 different Google Meets for an hour each, one with elementary, one with our secondary, just talking through the reality of this. Because they know that teachers, in a grand world, teachers have a week of lesson plans at a time. They certainly have a big year-long plan, but they write their plans a week at a time. In order for a principal to truly think that they're going to even approve big topics, even within a week's time, a teacher's not going to be able to teach that content if they have to wait on the principal to say, I'm approving this. And that was weighing heavily on our principals. And we talked a lot about what the law says, what this says, what's black and white, what's gray, and how do we live in the gray. But ultimately, the most important thing that I heard from everybody that I've spoken to is the importance of the professionalism of our teachers. And how do we value that, and how do we make sure they understand the value that we place in them? And also not put them on the hot seat of an island by themselves. Because in these days and times, I don't want to be by myself. When I started teaching in 1990, I started teaching I taught 6th grade music, 7th and 8th grade health, and 7th and 8th grade PE. That's what I taught. Had not a single textbook. But I made all those decisions by myself. Even for 7th and 8th grade health, I made those decisions by myself. Nobody approved it. Nobody did. Today, in the society that we live in today, I don't want that responsibility. I want a team around me to help me know where are my blind spots? What did I miss? Because I'm focused on, I need this content, I want it for my kids, this child needs this and this child needs that. But my team helps me see the blind spots and what I might be missing. What is another perspective that might see this? And so the procedures that you see that are outlined on the second page of IGK for the proposed policy talks about a process where the principal still has input, but ultimately the teacher's professionalism is honored. And so we would use their PLC or their department as their team, and they would present this and those 5 things that Mr. Satterfield pointed out. Those are straight from the law, the criteria that we would utilize to look at the materials and make sure that they are abiding by the law. If there's no question there and the team approves it, then that material can be used. If there's any question at all, then that material would then go to the API, who would then go to the principal and talk through that to see what needs to happen with that. Now, the academic freedom policy says all controversial material goes to the principal. That would still remain. If you've got a content that's deemed controversial, then that material would then have to go to the principal for approval. That makes things manageable for principals. It allows our professionals, our teachers, to be professionals, and it gives them support around them with what they're making decisions of. So that's what we're proposing. Now, the other changes are just updating things like film strips, which we don't have film strips anymore. So that's just updating that list. But I'll stand for questions on the proposal.
Can I ask, since you brought up the second page of the proposed policy, I have a couple of questions regarding that process. Because Are the, I'm trying, are the PLCs and department teams, are they already regularly meeting? So this would not be a new committee for teachers? Okay, so it wouldn't add any additional burden to discuss all of their supplemental materials within these teams?
I'm not going to say it won't add any additional time, but as they're planning together and talking about their materials, it would be fairly natural conversation around the materials that they're using.
So under this policy, if you're going to use videos, websites, any of those types of materials that are constantly, I think that that's probably where we see the most problems with, how quickly information changes. That's the difference between now and 20 years ago. And that would be what I could see would be problematic from if it's overly burdensome to a principal or even this team. I mean, but this policy would still say every time you want to use a website, every time you want to use YouTube, every time that you have to bring it to this team and this team has to sign off on it before you use it in your classroom. Is that
Unless it's something off of our district frameworks. So our district frameworks, our curriculum, those things have already been vetted and approved.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's something outside of that, then that's where you would have to make sure that you're bringing those things to your team.
Well, and that's what the supplemental policy is about. What
Right.
hasn't been vetted already by the district that you're just bringing in because, I've had I've talked to a history teacher who talked about bringing case law, when the case law decisions are being changed, or the Federalist Papers, what's approved under a standard or not, that's a common sense. You would think that would be, you would want to bring that in. Websites and some other materials are a little bit different. And I would just think that that's what this policy is intending, that, a website or, like those things that just change so much, that's not necessarily going to be, you just can't bring that in without getting it approved. Is that,
And what you look at today could be different tomorrow on a website. So that's
right.
where teachers
Which-
have to be
which-
very careful
which-
with.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. That makes you question whether or not you should be using certain websites or things that do change all of the time, because it does create, that's why we're even discussing these policies, is the information available now and the way that it, changes, and that is something that's
right.
new to us now. All right. I don't think Mr. Satterfield has anything to say. Mr. Satterfield.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great explanation of what teachers and principals do go through. And I learned very early on as a principal that I was not the smartest person in the building. If you sit in an AP physics class, or you're there and you just hope they don't ask you any questions. I think there's this perception that if I teach ninth grade English, all ninth grade English teachers teach the exact same thing. And they don't. They teach the same standards. They're expected to follow those standards, the state standards. But if my class is a lower level class, or it depends on the makeup of my class, I might go at a different pace. I might look for different resources. And that's what we expect teachers to do. That's what you want for your children. You want teachers that are intelligent and are trying to meet the needs of their students. I think I like this policy because you don't ask, it's not fair and it's not reasonable to expect the principal to be able to approve everything that they use as far as supplemental materials. There will be times when teachers may talk to their department head on the hall and say, look, I think I'm going to show this TED Talk. I think this will help pull together that my kids are struggling with a certain concept or something like that. I wouldn't want this to be a formal, or us to perceive it as a formal step-by-step procedural thing for teachers. That's just like saying, we don't trust you. We don't trust your professional judgment. And imagine being I don't care if you're in elementary, middle school, or like you were saying, you didn't have a book. high school students take a lot of electives. I know that you all know that. You remember back when you were in high school. I had a teacher that taught the history of Vietnam. There was no textbook. And every day, he was the only one who taught that course. I mean, the other teachers didn't have a idea or what he was teaching. So he was a great teacher, and he did a great job with that course. So we have to be very careful not to think that we're supposed to map out every step that teachers take. Does that make sense? We need to, I understand the premise behind wanting to make sure everything is appropriate, and that's good. There's nobody, I don't think anybody questions that. But you need to give the teachers the freedom and the leeway to meet the needs of their kids and not be too overly restrictive. And teachers are professionals. We should treat them as such.
Ms. Huddle?
I think the reason why this regulation got passed is because there were controversial things going into curriculum. And I get not putting all that weight on the principal, and I get trusting the teachers who teach the subjects. But I feel like if we're going to, I think the intent of the policy, even the school board's model policy, it has options for the reviewer, and those options are the principal or assistant principal. They're not a teacher committee. Now, I'm fine with the teacher committee personally, but I think if we're going to do that, we've got to put some more meat into here about controversial items. And I don't think it's good enough just to say we have this other policy, because, I mean, we've had problems with this. And changing this policy as recommended would not have fixed that. So I think that's should be our goal is to not repeat past issues. So that's my only suggestion, is if we're going to go down that path, let's beef up the process for making sure that things are not political or controversial. I mean, we've had issues with brain pop. I've heard all, and I don't even know if that's used anymore, but just, making sure that if we're going to use material, that lens of, is this purely academic and not any kind of other stuff in there. I just wanna see that.
Let me just respond to that, just real simple. I think I can help clear the air with some of that. I understand there are always an anomaly. I don't care if you're in the medical field, legal field, electricians, plumber. There are always situations that do come up. But that's what principals are for. That's what an administrative team is for. If there's a situation, an isolated situation, then you address it in the best manner, and you give the principals and the team the opportunity to address it. But I remember my first year, I sent out I don't remember the situation, but I sent out an email to everybody on staff to make sure everybody was doing, and boy, did I get some feedback from that. They said, are you kidding? 98% of us are doing exactly right. You sent everybody an email because we're professionals. You sent everybody an email because of 2 people in the whole building? There are hundreds of people here. So I understand what you're saying. Every now and then you're going to have an isolated issue that you'll deal with. I'm sure that Ms. Barnhart's had people that work with air conditioning, and maybe they're reliable and maybe they're not. That's okay. But I would just want to be cautious that we don't relay to teachers that because of an isolated incident or something that you hear about on the news, that we need to establish a policy for everything to address such a thing. That's my point. Thank you.
So I'm struggling with this one on how you even revise it or not, because I really feel like there needs to be some kind of accountability provision. Because even this doesn't really have an accountability provision. When the original policy, which has been in effect since 2013, this is not like a new thing that we are just like trying to be sensational and draft. The principal had the authority. In this policy, where there's a process, which I think, when I first read the policy, it led to my questions to you. I mean, I hear, like, the reason why we don't want to have the principal accountable, to approve materials is because that's overly burdensome. Well, you hear from teachers all the time that they don't have enough time to plan their lessons, for all of these meetings that we put on them, and honestly, I feel like I don't want to put more on the teachers. I mean, an administrator that, you have that managerial role, like that kind of plays, and that is not to take away from how much our principals are doing, and it offends me, honestly, to hear, well, you're not taking into account what your administrators are doing. I really feel like everybody is probably overworked. It's not a slight. It's so easy to misspeak and have your words just twisted around. I'm not trying to say that, but teachers always say, they're always grading papers, they're always trying to plan lessons. Adding another committee or longer requirements for a committee, I'm hesitant to do that as well. You kind of can't win. But there does need to be some kind of measure of accountability. And at the end of the day, Dr. Ross, you did mention, and I think that's a point that I didn't consider, and it's a good point, about you have electives that aren't necessarily, they don't have approved textbooks, and there's supplemental materials that create their class, but there's got to be an approval process to create that class. Like, you don't just create a class and nobody's looking at it, and there is no oversight on that. There's already an oversight procedure for an elective, and for that. So that's a little bit different than what we're talking about as we're trying to address this policy. At the end of the day, and this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, I am sure, but for all of our core classes that are covered under state standards, we have books and we have materials for teachers to use. And if they choose to use supplemental materials to help out in their classroom, there should be an approval process for that. I don't feel like we have so many requests. I mean, how do you have so much time to? I understand that some teachers may not operate that way, but what if we were to say, hey, we should get rid of the academic freedom policy, and we should get rid of the supplemental material policy?
No, but let me just share this with you.
We could do that.
Teachers do not just teach from the textbook.
They
just don't. They are right now. There are teachers at 10 o'clock at night that are looking for materials to be used in their classroom
I am
tomorrow.
not saying that is not a true statement.
No.
I'm just saying that I believe that there should be some kind of accountability measure that I don't see in this. That's just my opinion. I don't know. I mean.
You know, if I share some context, and I do appreciate that. I think one of the things is, I'm just looking at it from a practitioner. We tried that before. So when this first came out, the question was, all right, well, how do we get this with some vetting embedded into it? And all materials, because this is not just core, it's everything that a child sees in the building is going to have to go through this process. So that's when we gave it to the principals, kind of as looking at it, if it's outside of what's already approved. And one of the things I got a call about was the principal says, well, all right, I need 10 days then. I need 10 days to review everything because I'm getting it from 60 different teachers or 120 different teachers. And then the teacher said, well, that's an undue burden on me because of it slows down my planning. So to try to speed it up, we came up with this process. We recognize it's a shift for all. It's going to be a shift for the administration. It's going to be a shift for the teachers. One thing that hasn't shifted since '86, though, was the preamble of that policy, is that we need the supplemental materials to enrich, extend, and remediate. Because right now, next week we're going to talk about the scores. And the question is going to be, Dr. Ross, what are you going to do to lift these scores up? And one book is not going to do it with 9 or 8 different reading levels in those classes. So this was kind of a happy medium. It's not happy medium, but this was a way we could try to get teachers with faster feedback. But also, I do think, maybe incorporating in here that language of controversial so that they know that the principal still has to, because if it's mundane, then it can turn around faster. But if it is a situation that's outside of the traditional standards, every course is relying on standards or learning objectives. But the materials, that is what we always gave to the teacher to meet, to extend, enrich, and remediate. So that's just the shift that we're making now.
Right.
And
I
I'll
don't
call
mean that,
attention
I feel
to-
like, I don't think, I do believe that there are necessary supplemental materials. I don't think that, I'm being extreme in saying we could just get rid of all of them because the teachers are given materials, and that is a very extreme statement. And I'm just trying to prove a point that there should be some type of accountability process. I don't know that this is it. What worries me the most about this policy is, does it add more burden? Are we going to hear from teachers that you're creating another committee and making me do more work, when that wasn't the intent when we were discussing this necessarily? So
I'm going to give you a little bit of opinion, but a little bit of information from a teacher perspective as well on that. But first of all, I'm going to give you the law. So on page 5 of the law, it's section 5A, just so you know where the whole approval idea even comes from, is in section 5A, where it says any new instructional material must be determined to comply with and satisfy the criteria set out in section 3 of this regulation prior to be made available to students in the classroom, school library, media center, or reading list. So that is the statement of approval. So it just says that we have to make sure that it complies with. It doesn't say who has to determine that. It just simply says that it has to comply. So the process of teachers utilizing a team to develop whether or not it complies does abide by the law. I think whether or not teachers think this is one more thing or not depends on how it's set forth with the board. I think Mr. Satterfield said it well when he said, we can't think of this as a lockstep process that we're going to check off boxes and we're going to sign off on the dotted line. Mm-hmm. I personally can see that I've got a 20-minute break, because for elementary schools, their teachers are going to say we've got about a 20-minute break. And I can see in 20 minutes I go and I say, guys, I found this video. Can you look over it with me really quick? And within a matter of about 2 or 3 minutes, they've looked at it. The group says, hey, that's great. I think I'm going to use it too, or maybe I'm not going to use it or whatever. But they've gotten approval from their team for utilizing that video. They've gotten input from that. If we approach it in that sense, I don't think we're going to hear from teachers as saying this is an overburden to them, because I think that's what they do naturally. I do think it's going to, we have some teachers that maybe feel like they're on an island, like, for instance, some of our electives. But what that's going to allow is our Leadership Tuesdays, where all of those electives from across the district come together into one place. They can share there at that time, and they'll have a team instead of being alone by themselves. So I think it depends on how we frame it here, mm-hmm, as to how our teachers are then going to respond.
All right. Anyone else? Ms. Barnhart?
I guess just as a whole, we were talking about this as a large topic, and obviously it is. We're changing policy, and it's good that we are having these discussions, because that's what we're here for as a board to do. And it might not be comfortable, it might not be the funnest part, but it is what we are here to do. And 20 years ago, there's a lot of instances that we're seeing today, isolated instances, I guess you could call them, that we weren't seeing 20 years ago. They were unheard of. And I think that the reason that, as the State Department of Education nationally, this is a discussion, it's because of, kind of since COVID, we've seen a lot of instances, isolated instances, that the parents, the community members, other teachers, the nation as a whole is kind of asking questions. And so it's just good to get out in front of it and to make sure that we do have policy that fully and wholly describes exactly what we're what we're asking our teachers, what we're asking our school boards, what we're asking, you know, everybody who works in this area to do. And I'm glad we're having this discussion, and I'm glad that we're going to continue with these and the policies that we have next week as well. But I think there is a reason that we are having to have them, but it's good that we are, because then it just really gets down to the nitty-gritties of what we're expecting out of our school districts as a whole, not just this one. So that's just my 2 cents.
Mr. Scully.
Yeah, I'll respectfully use your argument to counter you as far as the accountability. I don't think teachers need accountability in the policy. Their professional certification is their accountability. Their annual reviews are their accountability. And regarding the frequency of this issue, I disagree. We haven't had a lot of problems in this district. In fact, based on your interpretation, you could say that we haven't had any problems. And I know somebody referenced an incident previously. I never saw a problem with that. So I don't believe we have problems. So to your point about how often is this actually going to happen, to me, it hasn't yet. And my question is, how does a chalkboard or a whiteboard or an overhead escape scrutiny here? Because anytime a teacher writes on the chalkboard, that's a supplemental material. Right. So is the principal running down the hall every time somebody's writing on the board to duck their head in to approve it? I mean, what are we doing? So we've got to let the professionals be professional. Their accountability is their professionalism, their certifications, and the institutional credibility, the district's credibility, through our review process, our performance reviews. That's how we hold teachers accountable. They shouldn't. Why are we holding them to, or trying to hold them to higher standards than medical professionals, or any other industry where professionals don't have somebody constantly looking over their shoulder, because they are allowed to be professional. And, you know, controversial issues are you can make anything controversial. Anytime a globe is in a teacher's classroom today, that is controversial, because some people think it should look like this. So who's right? I mean, based on, should a globe have to be independently approved to be in a classroom? That's a material. So we need to give teachers as much freedom as possible to be professionals. So,
Ms. Snipes?
I just want to say, Ms. McCaskill, thank you for all that is ahead with the policies as you try to juggle what's coming down that we can't control mixed with our feedback and comments. I do not envy you and your team, but we do appreciate this. And to Barnhart's, to Ms. Barnhart's comments, I am glad though that we are having the conversations, and more importantly having them openly, because I know we're all getting a lot of feedback. Some of it's varying, some of it's similar in a lot of ways, and I think we all want to do. Obviously, we all want to follow the law, but then we also want to do the best we can to support the teachers. So we just thank you for kind of giving us some guidance on how to work that into the policies.
Thank you.
So just to respond to Mr. Scully, since he addressed me directly, I appreciate your comments, because it gives me the ability to provide some clarification of like how you have these conversations and things kind of get twisted a little bit. Just from the term accountability, I agree. Like our teachers, and I have heard a lot in the last week about about how important it is for our teachers to be treated as the professionals that they are, because they are the professionals. They are the ones that are in the classroom. You should be able to allow, a teacher should be able to write on a chalkboard, or I guess we don't have those anymore because we have whiteboards and all of this, smart boards. They should be able to write and not have to feel like they need permission to do that. That's such an extreme example. When I say accountability, and I think where I'm coming, and I may be phrasing it the wrong way, and the concern that I have with the policy having these teams where it's collectively decided whether or not something should be, a material should be used or not, is like those outlier cases where something shouldn't be approved that is approved. And a teacher that was not involved in that approval process using a material that later on becomes controversial because it shouldn't have been used or it wasn't used the way it was intended to be used. When you have a team and there isn't one person that says, like, you have this approval, for probably more so for like the controversial conversations, and Dr. Ross and Ms. Huddle are right, like kind of firming up that language might help me be able to see this. But I see this as, what if you have a controversial team approve something that intentionally or unintentionally, probably unintentionally, goes against the spirit of the regulation, and that's how it got in. There wasn't like real approval. I'm really thinking out loud, trying to reconcile that. And I get the professionalism. Listen, I mean, I am married to an educator who has probably different opinions than I do on this, who taught history, and there are a lot of materials, especially like right now with changing, with everything that's changing in the world, that you want to supplement in a classroom. I get that. That's why it's so hard to write policy, because it's hard to write the policy. So that does not mean at all that I don't believe that our teachers are professionals, or that I believe this policy is something that would be used all of the time in a bad way, or even 0.1% of the time. That's what we're charged to talk about. All right, Mr. Satterfield. And
Last word.
Yep.
But isn't it a shame that we live in a world now that you have to protect, you got to have a policy or law or rule to try to cover everything. Teachers haven't changed over the years. They've been doing this out of passion for students. They have never done it for the money. Again, after 33 years of working with teachers and seeing some of the things they go through, we talked about a situation today where, it was almost dangerous for a teacher, but they'll still come back. And so I don't think that we should be so compelled and so focused on thinking that we have to have something spelled out exactly for every possible scenario. Because you raise kids, I raise kids, you can't cover every possible scenario. I was on the District Discipline Code Review Committee, and every year we got together and we would have a whole new bunch of things that wasn't in the discipline code before that kids found a way of doing. So, but that's just part of the process. That's part of dealing with children. But again, I think that we are getting too consumed with thinking that we have to cover everything and pinpoint everything. Again, let the teachers, leave them alone. Let them be professionals. And just like we want to be left alone in our jobs. So,
all right.
That's all. And in closing, I'll let Matt do his thing.
Hold on. Before that, I do want to, we did say we were going to kind of join 19 and 20, and we didn't really get into that. And what I will ask the board, we can get in and go through it line by line, but it seems that this policy is the model policy that was suggested, and what has not been included in this are the job titles of who should be responsible for what function. And what I would suggest, that when we bring this back to the board, that the administration provide that initial recommendation of who should be, should the school library media specialist be the designee, the superintendent's designee, or should, whatever that is, or what do you?
Well, what I was going to ask is, I'll be honest, I'm not sure IJL is necessary.
Okay.
Because if you look at it, what IJL is doing is talking exactly what we've been talking about tonight. It's saying that who's responsible for selection of materials? We were just talking about that. So I really believe that the language from IJL, if we want to add something to IJK, we could, or simply IJK really is what IJL is. It's outlining who's responsible for materials and who's responsible for making sure that the materials are appropriate, that they're educational rigor. It's the same criteria that we've outlined in IJK. We could add some of that verbiage, because what we did was we put those 5 things in IJK and then said, and it's consistent with the selection criteria set forth in State Board Regulation 43-170, which is these 7 bullets that are in IJL. So we've kind of set it already in IJK, so I'm wondering if the board would like to consider one policy versus 2 policies to make sure that we don't, because what I'm afraid of is if we use this IJL, we're actually going to contradict ourselves a little bit if we're not careful. So
Does anybody disagree? Okay,
got it.
all right.
So we did
do you have any
recommend
idea?
first reading for IJK, but it sounds like we just want to come back for a discussion the next time. Is that what I'm hearing? Because we did recommend IJK going forward as a first reading.
Yeah, I think we probably aren't there yet.
Okay.
Maybe if there's another discussion with some of that language included.
We'll try to combine IJL
okay.
with it. That's
All right,
perfect.
Mr. Hogan?
I've just got one question for Kevin, a comment, or Mr. Scully, excuse me. Is the world flat or is it round? I want an opinion.
No.
Okay, just making
It's
sure. I
round.
didn't know if you were a flat earther or not. I can go to 21 if you're ready.
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
A second.
I heard Ms. Snipes first. I saw him and then I heard you. So Ms. Snipes seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Motion carries 7-0.